Let's talk about glucose. Okay. So in order for you to understand your glucose, we had previous lectures in which we spent a lot of time with understanding as to how the kidney handles this glucose, right? First and foremost, normally should you be urinating your glucose? No. Almost all of it gets reabsorbed. It should, normally, through your glucose transporters. That we've talked about in great detail when dealing with proximal convoluted tubule. Now, if by chance your patient has hyperglycemia, then at some point you may then hit, what are you going to hit first? What's that term called medically where you detect glucose early on in the urine? Good. That's called renal threshold, right? Not TM. That's transport maximum, renal threshold. So if you start finding glucose within the urine, be careful. Will not detect fructose or other sugars. So when you use these dipsticks, be careful. So glucose could be detected, but if your patient is suffering from fructosuria and so forth, it won't detect it. So you have to be smart. Your patient is exhibiting issues of cataracts and such, and your glucose comes back to be negative, you're still detecting something like fructosuria, you need to use something else to find it. Detects glucose in the urine as low as 30 milligrams per deciliter. Do you understand how low this is? Point is, are you supposed to have any glucose in the urine? Basically, no. So you need to have effective dipstick that finds glucose even at really low levels. Serum glucose plus glucosuria, obviously, we're referring to diabetes mellitus. Now, normal serum glucose plus glucosuria, normal pregnancy. Do you understand the difference? So if you find serum glucose to be elevated, what's normal glucose? Give it to me. Approximately 100, right? Normally, approximately 100. Keep it simple right now so you understand the significance. If your serum glucose is elevated, take a look at the arrow, and you have glucosuria, what's your diagnosis? Diabetes mellitus. Stop. If your serum glucose is normal, but your patient has glucosuria, how about a pregnant lady? I talked about pregnancy in great detail. When you're pregnant, a female, then her plasma volume increases up to perhaps even 50% in increase. That's a lot of plasma volume that could be increased potentially. Number 2, do you remember her renal threshold? Before we move there, well, tell me about a female. And what about her ability to take in glucose into her tissue? Is it impaired, or is it taking up the glucose in great abundance? Think before you speak. The fetus, she's pregnant. That fetus wants food. Mama, feed me. Now, you have glucose in that mother, in her plasma. Don't you want to feed that fetus? So therefore, her ability to take up glucose in her skeletal muscles are impaired on purpose, physiologically, so that she can then deliver the glucose passing through the placental barrier to the fetus. Are we clear? We'll talk more about this when we talk about gestational diabetes mellitus, won't we? So normal serum glucose, glucosuria, perhaps you're thinking about pregnancy. Low threshold, don't memorize it, understand it. Low threshold for glucose in a pregnant lady. Benign glucosuria, low renal threshold for glucose. And that's just, let's say, genetically speaking, a patient is just born with a low renal threshold. Do you understand how important it was for us to walk through the physiology so that you understand the concept of renal threshold? What does that mean to you? The early signs of finding glucose in your urine. Let's continue. So what about microalbuminuria as being a dipstick? Well, if you find microalbuminuria along with glucosuria, well, you know that this is diabetic nephropathy. More sensitive than standard dipstick. Remember, if you use a standard dipstick, you may not find albumin in your urine at low levels. But there's a microalbuminuria dipstick, sensitive at very low levels. Microalbuminuria plus glucosuria, they'll give you information in which you can then arrive at the proper diagnosis. Here, diabetic nephropathy. What if it was ketones that you find? Now, before we begin, tell me simple biochemistry for ketones. Breakdown product of which one of these? Is it protein? No. Is it carbohydrates? No. Is it lipid? Yes. Are we clear? Your best example would be something like diabetic ketoacidosis. What happens? More likely in which type of diabetic? More likely in which diabetic mellitus patient? Type 1. Why? No insulin to begin with. You tell me. Insulin responsible for breaking down what? Carbohydrate, protein, or is it lipid? Obviously carbohydrates. Really? Yeah, of course you know this. Insulin responsible for breaking down carbohydrate so that you can have the glucose and company, correct? Now, my point is this. You go through glycolysis. Say that you don't have insulin. Wow, I still need energy. So if you can't get it from carbohydrate, who are you turning to? Turning to me. No, you're turning to lipids. So you're going to break down your lipids, and that lipid is going to do what? Break down into ketones. You've heard of beta oxidation, have you not? Of course you have, from biochem. So if you're weak in beta oxidation, I would quickly take a look at your topic on ketones. So you're breaking down your lipid. What are some important ketones that you want to know? Take a look. Now pay attention. So now that you've understood or recapped DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, worst case scenario, where you're breaking down ketones in great excess, you have to, because you're left with no other choice. And some of these ketones include acetone, acetoacetic acid, and beta-hydroxybutyric acid. Here's detects acetone, acetoacetic acid, but not, pay attention, not beta-hydroxybutyric acid. Why is that important? Well, beta-hydroxybutyric acid is one of those ketones that you produce as with alcohol metabolism. Is that clear? So now I'm giving you two differentials for ketones appearing pathologically. Number one, diabetic ketoacidosis. What's the other one? Alcohol. Now, in alcohol, you produce mass amounts of beta-hydroxybutyric acid, but this ketone dipstick is not going to measure it. So you're going to come back negative for ketones. But for Pete's sakes, if your patient is telling you that I'm drinking 1 bottle of Jack Daniel per day, are you kidding me? Of course that's alcohol. Of course there's alcoholic type of metabolic acidosis taking place. Nitroprusside in the test system only reacts with acetoacetic acid, acetone, but not the beta-hydroxybutyric acid. So look for your ketone dipstick being negative even in a patient who's an alcoholic who you know is producing ketones such as beta-hydroxybutyric acid. Let's continue.